It started with a whisper, a rumor no one in the royal circle wanted to believe. That something had been found. Something buried deep within Meghan Markle's private holiday villa, and that what it contained had left even King Charles in stunned silence. But what could possibly shake a man who's seen it all? What could silence an entire institution that has survived wars, scandals, and abdications? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You're about to find out. The discovery began innocently enough, or so they said. A quiet inspection, a private property in a discreet coastal location, sunlight bouncing off the marble floors, the faint scent of gardenias in the air. The villa had been empty for weeks. Meghan was reportedly abroad, attending a quiet event, while her staff handled minor maintenance. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something was stirring. Something about that place had always carried whispers. Hidden safes, secret correspondence, locked rooms that no one entered. And then, someone found it. A sealed box. Heavy, ornate, wrapped in faded silk ribbon and wax that hadn't been broken in years. The kind of box that instantly tells you, this isn't meant to be touched. Inside it, investigators would later say, were letters. Handwritten. Some marked with official seals. Others bearing names that had no business appearing in Meghan's possession. Alongside them, photographs, aged and yellowed at the edges, depicting moments that were never meant to be public. Royal meetings, private exchanges, faces caught in expressions that told stories words couldn't. And when King Charles reportedly saw what was inside, even he was said to be in disbelief. So what was in those letters? Who took those photographs? And why were they hidden, sealed away in a villa thousands of miles from Buckingham Palace? Viewers, this wasn't just a casual find. This was a revelation that tore open old wounds, reignited buried suspicions, and brought the royal family's trust to a breaking point. Because, as insiders now whisper, these weren't just mementos. They were evidence. Evidence of conversations that never should have happened. Evidence of relationships that blurred every royal boundary. And maybe, just maybe, evidence of a plot that began long before Meghan ever stepped foot into the palace. Imagine for a moment, a world where every secret you've ever buried, every private word you've ever spoken, every hidden plan you've ever made, was sitting in a box on someone else's shelf. That's what the royal family faced that day. One palace insider described it as the moment everything changed. Another said King Charles's reaction wasn't anger, it was heartbreak. He didn't shout. He didn't demand explanations. He simply sat there, staring at one particular letter for several minutes, before quietly whispering, "This can't be real." But apparently it was. The room reportedly fell silent. Advisors exchanged looks. No one dared move. The implication was too big. The handwriting, the dates, the content, everything pointed to a truth no one was ready to accept. And yet, even as the royal family scrambled to contain the news, the whispers began to spread. First within the palace walls, then across the British media circuit, then into the corners of international press rooms. Something monumental had been uncovered, but no one could say what. Was it correspondence between Meghan and a senior royal? Was it documentation of royal discussions before the so-called Megxit? Or was it something far deeper, something that could rewrite how we understand the royal family itself? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how long had Meghan kept it hidden? Let's rewind. Before the villa was ever searched, there had been speculation. Insiders often spoke of the Villa Vault, a private space where Meghan allegedly kept personal effects from her time as a working royal. Letters from world leaders, early drafts of speeches, gifts, diaries. Normal, harmless things, at least on the surface. But others suggested something darker. A control file, as one insider called it, a record of interactions, agreements, even leverage, quietly preserved in case of conflict. A shocking idea, right? Yet when you consider how volatile the relationship between Meghan and the palace had become, how every gesture, every statement seemed to escalate into international drama, it doesn't sound so far-fetched anymore. And that's the contradiction that makes this story impossible to ignore. Was Meghan a victim of palace politics, or a master strategist who saw every move years in advance? You decide. The truth is, even before this discovery, the royal family had been walking on eggshells around the Duchess. Every new headline, Every documentary, every podcast brought fresh waves of tension, but none of them compared to what was found in that sealed box. Because this time, it wasn't Meghan speaking, it was the evidence speaking for her. And what it said was explosive. Sources close to the situation described the letters as meticulously organized. Each envelope labeled by date, some even cross-referenced with initials. This wasn't a random stash. It was curated, deliberate, purposeful. But why keep them? What would possess anyone, let alone someone who claimed to have moved on from royal life, to preserve materials tied to the most confidential royal affairs? Was it nostalgia, fear, insurance, or something even more calculated? These are the questions that haunted the palace in the hours after the discovery. Because no matter how you interpret Meghan's motives, one thing became clear: she knew more than anyone thought. And what made this even more unsettling was that the letters didn't just contain royal correspondence. Some reportedly hinted at personal matters, private disagreements, emotional exchanges, and early discussions about Harry's royal exit long before it was announced. Think about that. If true, it would mean Meghan had been preparing for her royal break months, maybe even years, before the public story began. That she wasn't blindsided by hostility or pushed out by the firm. She was orchestrating a plan all along. And if that's the case, what else was she planning? Imagine being in the king's position. You open a sealed envelope, expecting routine correspondence, and instead find traces of premeditated strategy. Names, timelines, signatures, all pointing towards something that contradicts the version of events the world was told. It's like finding out a chapter of your own family history was ghostwritten by someone else. For King Charles, that must have felt like betrayal wrapped in ink. But for others, like Prince William and Princess Anne, it felt like confirmation of what they'd suspected all along. There had always been whispers that Meghan's charm had limits, that behind the smiling interviews and glamorous appearances was someone playing a much longer game. But until that moment, it had been just that, whispers. Now, it was ink on paper. One royal aide allegedly described the atmosphere as panic mixed with vindication. Another said, "It wasn't what we found, it's what it proved." Because if the letters were authentic, then they revealed something deeply uncomfortable. Meghan hadn't just been reacting to royal life. She'd been documenting it. Every word, every encounter, every contradiction, recorded, preserved, sealed away. Almost as if she knew, someday, the truth would be useful. And that realization sent a chill through the palace halls. Because while the royal family has always prided itself on tradition, discretion, and silence, this discovery shattered all three at once. The box wasn't just filled with paper, it was filled with power. Power over perception, power over narrative, power over legacy. And suddenly, everyone was asking, who else knew? Did Harry know about the letters? Did he help preserve them? Or was he just as blindsided as everyone else? Those questions tore through royal circles faster than headlines ever could. And if reports are true, it wasn't long before Harry himself was brought into a private call, the same night the king received word of the discovery. What was said in that conversation remains one of the most tightly guarded secrets of all. But one thing's for sure, whatever Harry heard, it changed the tone of his relationship with his father forever. So here we are, a sealed villa, a hidden box, letters and photographs that may expose the inner workings of the world's most famous family, and a royal dynasty now struggling to understand how much of its past has just been rewritten. But this story, this discovery, is only beginning. Because what investigators found next, buried beneath those letters, wasn't just shocking. It was historic. And when they pulled it from the bottom of the box, even the most loyal royal aides gasped in disbelief. It wasn't another letter. It was a photograph. And in that photo was a face no one ever expected to see. A face that could change everything the royal family thought it knew about trust, loyalty, and truth itself. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It began on an ordinary morning that would turn into anything but. The air above Montecito was calm. The ocean stretched glass-like beneath the early sun, and Meghan Markle's holiday villa, whitewashed, serene, and almost cinematic, stood quiet under the lazy hum of palm leaves. Nothing about that day hinted at what was about to happen. Nothing suggested that behind those designer curtains, an earthquake was waiting to shake the foundations of royal secrecy itself. The villa had always been described as impeccably private. It wasn't massive like other celebrity mansions. It was discreet, minimalist, and tastefully distant. Every inch reflected Meghan's polished image, refined, guarded, and carefully curated. From the French candles on marble counters to the hand-selected art pieces sourced from London galleries, it was a home that whispered control. But that morning, control was about to slip away. It started as a maintenance visit. A few staff members, a property manager, and one private inspector reportedly authorized to check certain storage areas following a humidity concern. Simple, routine, nothing more than a checklist and a cup of coffee. But as one of the inspectors later described it, the energy shifted when we reached the East Corridor. The East Corridor was rarely used. Meghan herself was said to avoid it, preferring the bright, open spaces closer to the ocean view. But down that narrow hall, past a small library filled with first editions and a faint scent of lavender polish, stood a single locked door. One of the team members asked, almost jokingly, "What's in there?" The property manager shrugged. "Private storage. Duchess's personal files, maybe. Nothing we're to touch." But something about the way he said it, the hesitation, the unease, made the others pause. Here's the thing about secrets. They don't stay quiet when curiosity walks by. The humidity reading spiked near that door, and protocol demanded inspection. Authorization was double-checked. A supervisor confirmed it. And with a soft metallic click, the door opened for the first time in years. What they found inside was haunting. The room was dim, lit only by the thin morning light slipping through shuttered blinds. Dust motes danced in the stillness. Against one wall stood a heavy oak cabinet, old-fashioned, with ornate brass corners. Beneath it, a large trunk, wrapped in cloth that had yellowed with time. One of the team whispered, "This looks antique." Another replied, "Maybe part of the decor." But then they saw it, the wax seal. Unbroken, thick, deep crimson, stamped with a crest that looked oddly familiar. A lion, a crown, and beneath it, a faint, almost invisible letter C. It wasn't just antique. It was royal. They froze. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The box looked sacred, like something out of a historical archive. "Should we even be looking at this?" someone murmured. But curiosity won again. With gloved hands, the inspector lifted the box. It was heavier than expected, dense, deliberate, as if its weight carried more than just objects. And when the light hit its surface, something shimmered, tiny flecks of gold leaf embedded in the design. Whoever made this box had meant it to last. They set it on the table. Silence filled the room. You could hear the waves outside faintly crashing, the muffled call of a seagull. Then, the first ribbon snapped. The sound was quiet but final, like history exhaling. Inside were stacks of envelopes, neatly arranged, some tied together with delicate silk string. And beneath them, layers of old photographs, protected in transparent sleeves. One of the team members reportedly whispered, "Oh my God." Another replied, "These look official." It was then that one of the inspectors noticed something strange. Several of the envelopes bore wax seals identical to the one on the trunk. Others had faint royal insignias, subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever seen the official stationery of Buckingham Palace. Think about that for a second. Why would private letters bearing royal insignias be locked away in Meghan Markle's personal villa? Why hide them at all? And who sent them? The room grew colder as realization began to set in. This wasn't memorabilia. This was sensitive material, documents that shouldn't have been outside palace custody. Each envelope was marked with a date, written in careful cursive. Some dated years before Meghan's marriage to Prince Harry. Others years after. The inspector wanted to stop. The manager wanted to call someone. But who? Meghan's assistant? The authorities? Buckingham Palace itself? They hesitated. Then one of the investigators said, quietly, "If this is what I think it is, we need to document it immediately." And so they did. Photographs were taken. The seal impressions were analyzed. Every motion was logged. At first, they expected to find personal correspondence, maybe letters from friends, charity partners, or private notes between Meghan and Harry. But as they began to carefully review the envelope's markings, it became clear this wasn't private sentiment. It was institutional, political, historical. Some of the envelopes bore the mark "privileged communication." Others carried notations like "For His Majesty's eyes only." That phrase alone sent a chill through the room. For His Majesty's eyes only. And yet here those letters were, hidden, sealed, in Meghan Markle's villa thousands of miles away. The team exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered, "We should stop. This isn't for us." But the box, once opened, had already started to spill its truth. It's hard to describe the energy in that room. On one hand, awe, like stepping into a forbidden museum. On the other, fear, because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. And maybe that's why King Charles's reported reaction later carried such quiet devastation. He knew exactly what that seal meant. He knew the weight those words carried. But let's pause for a second and ask the real question. How did these letters even end up there? Because Meghan didn't stumble upon them accidentally. The room wasn't a public gallery. It was private, restricted, and curated. Someone had to place that box there intentionally. Was it Meghan? Harry? A staff member acting under instruction? Or someone else entirely? The mystery deepened when one of the investigators noticed something scratched faintly into the underside of the box lid. It wasn't visible at first glance. Only under the beam of a flashlight did the letters emerge. For safekeeping. 2 words. Nothing else. Safe from whom? That question still lingers. The discovery quickly became a logistical and ethical nightmare. Security protocols were invoked, and legal representatives were consulted. It wasn't long before word reached higher circles, people who understood what royal correspondence really implied. And that's when the situation escalated. Within hours, sources say, a private call was made to London. Not to the media, not to Meghan. Straight to palace intermediaries. The reaction was swift. Orders came down to secure the materials until proper authority could review them. But by then, the whispers had already begun. Because secrets don't stay buried in royal soil for long. By the next day, insiders claim, word of the villa discovery reached key figures within the monarchy. King Charles, Princess Anne, and reportedly, Prince William. And here's where things turn from curious to catastrophic. When palace aides first received the report, they assumed it was a misunderstanding, a mix-up involving old stationery or personal letters misfiled. But once photographs of the wax seals were confirmed, everything changed. The call that followed between the palace and the Montecito property team lasted hours. Tension was high, voices low, instructions deliberate. Every effort was made to ensure the situation didn't leak. But leaks have a way of finding daylight. A senior aide later described the atmosphere as the longest night the palace has had in years. Another insider said it felt like history repeating itself, except this time, the evidence was physical. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, the box hadn't been tampered with. The wax seals were intact until that very morning, which meant whoever hid it there never came back for it. Why? Was it forgotten? Abandoned? Or deliberately left behind as a silent message? Picture it. A woman once at the center of royal controversy, now oceans away, living her own version of freedom. And yet, somewhere in that freedom, a hidden vault, full of royal correspondence, waiting like a ticking clock. It makes you wonder, was this Meghan's insurance policy? Or someone else's attempt to expose her? Those who saw the materials described them as disturbingly organized. Letters stacked by year, notes cross-referenced, even posted annotations marking certain passages. It wasn't chaotic. It was strategic. And that raised the most chilling question yet. If this was a secret Meghan meant to keep, why make it so easy to trace? Unless it was never meant to stay hidden forever. Maybe, just maybe, this was part of something bigger, a controlled revelation waiting for the right time. A royal plot within a royal plot. And if that's true, it explains why King Charles reportedly went silent when he saw the photos. Because one of them, according to insiders, didn't just capture private family moments. It captured something that should never have existed outside the palace walls. An image of a confidential royal meeting, taken from an angle only an insider could access. And that image, resting at the very top of the photo stack, was said to show someone unexpected. A person whose presence made no logical sense. A face that didn't belong there. Because when the photo was analyzed more closely, the details raised an impossible question. What was Meghan doing there, years before she was supposed to be part of that circle? And if that image was real, not doctored, not coincidental, then the story of how Meghan Markle entered the royal family might be far more complicated than anyone has ever been told. The Montecito team didn't have the answers. But the palace demanded one thing above all: silence. No leaks, no hints, no whispers to the press. But silence can only last so long. Because behind that silence, suspicion began to brew. If Meghan's villa held royal documents, what else was being kept beyond the public eye? What other relics of royal life, letters, recordings, journals, were tucked away behind the curtain of California sunshine? The discovery at the villa was no longer just about what was found. It was about what it meant. And for the royal family, it meant one terrifying realization. The past they thought they had buried was waiting for them in a locked room thousands of miles away. But the most shocking part wasn't the box. It wasn't the letters. It wasn't even the royal seals. It was what came next. Because when palace officials finally took possession of the materials, they found something inside one of the envelopes that made even the most seasoned aides freeze in disbelief. A letter written in a hand so familiar, so unmistakable, that even King Charles himself couldn't deny its authenticity. And that letter would become the spark that turned curiosity into chaos. Because whoever wrote it wasn't supposed to have known Meghan at all. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The envelope trembled slightly as it was lifted from the box, not because of a breeze or a careless hand, but because everyone in that room could feel what it represented. History, scandal, betrayal, and something even more dangerous: truth. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, the kind of penmanship that comes from years of etiquette, discipline, and breeding. At first glance, it was unmistakable. Those loops, those flourishes, that subtle confidence in every curve of ink. The initials at the bottom sealed it: Cr. Charles Rex. King Charles. Imagine that moment. You're staring at a letter allegedly written by the King of England, years before Meghan Markle was even a household name. And yet, somehow, this letter had found its way into her private villa, locked in a box that hadn't been opened for years. How? Why? The room fell silent. Every instinct told them to stop reading. But curiosity, the kind that ruins reputations and rewrites history, took over. The letter began politely, formally. But halfway down the page, the tone shifted. The sentences grew personal, emotional even. It referenced the arrangement, preparations for future announcements, and maintaining discretion regarding the American contact. The American contact. Those two words sent chills down the spine of the investigator reading it aloud. Could it possibly refer to Meghan? And if so, what kind of arrangement could the king have been referencing before she'd ever officially met Prince Harry? Let that sink in. If this letter was genuine, it suggested that Meghan's connection to the royal family didn't begin with a blind date. It began with something else, something coordinated, hidden, and far more strategic. One royal historian who later analyzed the contents reportedly said, "If the dates are accurate, this changes everything we thought we knew about how Meghan entered the royal orbit." But that was just the beginning. Because beneath the king's letter were others, many others, each more disturbing than the last. Different handwriting, different voices, but all circling around one central theme: confidentiality, image control, and secrecy. One was signed with the initials AP, believed by some to be a senior palace advisor. It discussed a potential narrative shift regarding public perception and introduction timing. The language was vague, coded, but undeniably strategic. Another letter bore a more emotional tone, almost pleading. We must be cautious about what becomes known. Her connection could be misinterpreted. Her connection. You see the pattern forming here? Even before the world knew Meghan Markle's name, there were references to her existence. Quiet, discreet, carefully worded references that hinted she was already known to certain royal insiders long before the fairy tale engagement ever happened. Now, here's where the contradiction gets haunting. For years, the public believed Meghan and Harry's story began in 2016, introduced by a mutual friend over drinks in London. Simple, romantic, organic. But what these letters suggested was that Meghan wasn't a random encounter. She was a known quantity. Could it be that someone inside the palace had been tracking, or even preparing, for her entry long before it became official? And if that's true, then who was orchestrating it? Who benefited from her arrival? And more importantly, who wanted it to look spontaneous? The deeper the investigators read, the more the tone of the letters changed, from formality to familiarity. Some contained handwritten notes in the margins. Phrases like "handled discreetly," "her knowledge is deeper than expected," and "proceed with caution." Those weren't the words of gossip. Those were the words of people walking on eggshells. Now, imagine being the king, sitting there in his study at Clarence House, as aides hand you photocopies of letters bearing your own signature and others tied to your closest advisors. Each one dated, sealed, cataloged, and found in your daughter-in-law's possession. Would you believe your eyes? Or would you suspect you were being set up? Sources close to the palace said that King Charles initially refused to comment. He read the letters quietly, his expression unreadable. But after the third page, one witness said his hands began to shake. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply looked up and whispered, "How could she have these?" A devastating question, because there was no simple answer. Was it possible Meghan had obtained them innocently? That they'd been misplaced among Harry's private files? Maybe. But the organization, the labeling, the sequencing, it all suggested intention. Someone wanted these preserved. Someone knew their value. And that someone wasn't ready to let them disappear. Here's the emotional irony of it all. Meghan had often spoken about transparency, truth, and authenticity. Yet here was a hidden archive, a shadow record of royal dealings that told a story of control and secrecy. Do you see the contradiction? A woman who built her public image on openness, yet guarded her private correspondence with the caution of a spy. Maybe she was protecting herself, or maybe she was protecting something else entirely. The letters went beyond names and dates. They hinted at tension, even distrust within the royal family itself. There were veiled references to disagreements about approach, resistance to integration, and potential conflicts with senior members. One even mentioned concerns about loyalty. Loyalty, that word again. Every monarchy in history has lived or died by it. And here, in these handwritten letters, was the unmistakable scent of suspicion, long before the world ever saw cracks between the brothers, the accusations, or the headlines about betrayal. It wasn't just a family drama. It was a warning system written in ink. And the emotional impact was brutal. Imagine reading a letter where you are described not as a person, but as a liability under observation. Imagine realizing your family members were discussing how to manage your existence before you even walked down the aisle. If Meghan ever read these letters, and that's still unclear, it must have confirmed every fear she ever had about never being fully accepted. And yet, here's where the story twists again. Because one of the final letters didn't come from a royal aide or advisor. It came from Meghan herself. Yes, hidden among the correspondence was an envelope written in her own handwriting, smaller, more compact, as if she'd been trying to fit too much emotion into too little space. Dated months after her wedding, it was addressed to an unnamed recipient. The tone? Hauntingly personal. It began, "You said the walls were built to protect. But what happens when the walls begin to suffocate?" Let that sink in for a second. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't political. It was reflective, wounded, almost philosophical. Meghan spoke of being seen as both savior and scapegoat, of learning that silence isn't peace, and of keeping proof because memories fade, but paper doesn't. Keeping proof. There it was, the quiet confession, hidden between poetic metaphors and sorrowful lines. She wasn't hoarding letters out of malice. She was preserving them out of fear. Fear of being rewritten. Fear of losing her version of events. And that changes everything, doesn't it? Because suddenly, the sealed box isn't just a scandal. It's a survival strategy. A record of how one woman tried to protect herself from a system that had the power to erase her narrative overnight. But even that doesn't make it less explosive. When the royal family discovered that Meghan had not only kept but cataloged royal letters, including correspondence with the king himself, the trust that remained between them disintegrated overnight. William was reportedly furious and demanded an explanation. Camilla, according to whispers, said, "If she's kept one, she's kept more." The palace immediately commissioned handwriting experts, authenticity checks, and security reviews. And every test came back with the same haunting result. The letters were genuine. Real ink, real seals, real dates. And that meant only one thing. Someone had either passed them to Meghan directly, or she had access to restricted materials no one outside the palace should ever have seen. Theories began to multiply. Some claimed Harry himself may have been the link. perhaps unknowingly passing along sensitive correspondence during the early days of their courtship. Others whispered that Meghan had allies inside the palace, people who sympathized with her and ensured she'd never be completely powerless. But the most chilling theory of all, that she had kept them not as protection, but as leverage, that she had known, from the very beginning, that one day those letters might speak louder than any interview ever could. And perhaps that's why, when King Charles reportedly held the last of the letters in his hand, he didn't say a word. He just stared out the window, as if realizing that every attempt to control the narrative had just been undermined by a box of paper in California. Think about it. The monarchy has survived wars, divorces, deaths, and disasters, but nothing terrifies it more than written proof. Because letters don't lie. They don't forget. They can't be spun. And now, those letters were out there. So what happens next? What does a monarch do when the walls of discretion start to crack? Do they destroy the evidence? Confront the person who kept it? Or pretend it never existed? Sources say that after reviewing the letters, King Charles issued one quiet instruction to his private secretary: find out who knew. And that order set off a chain reaction across royal households, calls, meetings, and quiet conversations that stretched late into the night. Staffers were questioned. Archives were cross-checked. Security clearances reviewed. The palace had entered crisis mode. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the silence from Montecito was deafening. No statement. No denial. No acknowledgement of the discovery. Just calm. Almost too calm. As if Meghan knew exactly what they'd found and had been waiting for them to find it. And maybe she had. Because, according to one insider, the last page of her handwritten letter contained a single cryptic line. Truth has its own schedule. A line that could mean anything or everything. But there was still one more layer to this mystery. At the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, beneath the silk ties and the envelopes, lay something else. A thin envelope with no markings. No name. No seal. Just a date. June 2018. The same month as Meghan and Harry's wedding. And inside that envelope was a photograph. A photograph that would ignite the next level of the scandal. Because when they held it up to the light, everyone in the room saw it at once, and no one could believe who was in it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The photograph slid out of the envelope like a ghost, silent, delicate, and dangerous. No one spoke as it fell onto the table. The air in the room thickened instantly, the kind of tension that doesn't need sound to scream. The picture was old, at least 7 or 8 years by the look of the lighting, the clothes, the faces frozen in another time. The edges were slightly curled, but the clarity was razor sharp. You could see everything. The mahogany walls of a private royal meeting room. The glint of polished silver on a long conference table. The unmistakable emblem of the crown engraved on the folder lying in front of a seated figure. And standing near the back, half in the light, half in the shadows, was Meghan Markle, or someone who looked exactly like her. Her posture, her hair, her expression, it was uncanny. And yet, according to every official timeline, this photo shouldn't exist. Because the image was dated 2014, 2 years before Meghan and Prince Harry were even supposed to have met. Impossible, right? That's exactly what the investigators thought. They leaned in, zoomed on the face, cross-referenced the details. But the more they examined it, the less they could explain it away. The woman in the photo wasn't photoshopped. The lighting was consistent. The reflection in the silver tray matched her outline perfectly. There was no denying it. Meghan Markle had somehow been present in a royal meeting long before anyone knew she was connected to the family. The room erupted. Some of the aides whispered theories. Maybe she was working on a documentary. Maybe it's a coincidence. Others said nothing, too stunned to rationalize the impossible. But one of the investigators pointed out something no one had noticed yet. At the bottom of the photograph, barely visible, was a faint handwritten note. The same careful, looping cursive that matched the king's known handwriting. It read, "Meeting concluded. Sensitive matters discussed. Keep records secure." And below it, his signature, Charles Rex. The king had not only written on that photo, he'd authenticated it. Now the question wasn't just why Meghan was there, but why the king himself acknowledged it. The weight of that realization hit, like thunder. If this image was real, then either the royal family had been concealing earlier contact with Meghan, or the photograph captured something even bigger, a covert meeting that had been deliberately erased from the official record. Think about that. The British monarchy, with all its traditions and protocols, caught in a possible lie about when Meghan Markle first entered the picture. Was she part of a plan before the public even knew her name? Was this connection arranged behind closed doors, long before the fairy tale courtship narrative was spun? And if so, what was discussed in that meeting that needed a royal seal of secrecy? Inside the palace, panic was setting in. The photograph was quickly transported to a secured archive. Every attempt was made to trace its origin. Who took it? Who developed it? How did it end up in Meghan's possession? But the truth was slippery. Like fog over the Thames, every answer only made the picture murkier. For King Charles, the discovery was personal. He'd built his reign on transparency, on modernizing the monarchy for a new generation. Yet here was an artifact that could unravel the very timeline of how one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history came into their lives. He was reportedly seen pacing his study late into the night, the photo in his hand, murmuring, "It can't be her, it can't be." But it was. Handwriting experts confirmed the note was authentic. Photographic analysts found no evidence of manipulation. Even the type of camera lens used was consistent with those employed by palace photographers during private council sessions. Which meant one thing: Meghan was there. Now the question shifted from how to why. What business did a then-unknown American actress have in a meeting with senior royals in 2014? Was it charity-related? Diplomacy? Or something far more secret? Some insiders pointed to Meghan's early humanitarian work, her involvement with the UN Women's Campaign, and her growing visibility in global activism. They speculated that perhaps she'd been introduced to the palace through a political or philanthropic channel. But others weren't convinced. Because in the photo, she wasn't seated with guests or charity representatives. She was standing behind a chair reserved for senior staff, close enough to be privy to private discussions, far enough to remain unnoticed by the official attendees list. A shadow on the edge of history. That's when another detail surfaced, something almost no one saw at first glance. In the background, a mirror reflected part of the room from another angle. And in that reflection, you could clearly see another figure, one who definitely wasn't supposed to be there either. Prince Harry. Yes, you read that right. Harry was visible in the reflection, leaning forward in quiet conversation with one of his father's advisors. His face half-turned, his hand gesturing slightly. So if this was 2014, that meant Meghan and Harry had been in the same room 2 years before their public first meeting. Coincidence? Staged? Or covered up? The palace went into silent overdrive. Investigators were told to find every log, every calendar entry, every official record of royal meetings from that year. But something was missing. The date listed on the photo corresponded to a meeting that had been redacted from official minutes for security reasons. Security reasons. Those two words can cover a multitude of sins. Could it be that the palace had deliberately hidden the meeting's attendees to prevent questions? Or was it possible the meeting had nothing to do with royal affairs at all, and everything to do with something else entirely? One royal historian put it bluntly. If that photo is authentic, it suggests the story of Harry and Meghan's relationship is not what we were told. The narrative was curated, and that thought terrified Buckingham Palace more than any tabloid headline ever could. Because this wasn't gossip. This was evidence. And evidence doesn't vanish quietly. When the king's private secretary briefed him again later that evening, Charles reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before saying, "I want to know who kept this." Notice his words. Not who took it, but who kept it. That subtle shift meant he already suspected that this photo was deliberately saved, preserved, hidden for a reason. A royal aide later described that moment. The king wasn't just confused. He was hurt. If Meghan had this all along, it meant she'd been holding a secret from him, and possibly from Harry, for years. But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. Because when experts examined the back of the photo under infrared light, they found faint indentations, pressure marks left by a pen. Someone had written something on a sheet of paper laid over the photograph at some point in time. Those indentations, once enhanced, formed words. Words that read, "Keep one copy, destroy the rest." It was signed only with an initial, M. Now, could that M stand for Meghan? Possibly. But others believe it could refer to Martin, a senior palace aide known to handle archival materials. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery. Still, that hidden note implied intent. Someone had deliberately chosen to keep a copy of the photograph and to eliminate others. Which raises a haunting question. How many other images were destroyed before this one survived? And why did Meghan have the survivor? The discovery sent shockwaves through royal ranks. Aides who'd served for decades suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Hard drives were checked, photo archives reviewed, NDAs revisited. But one name kept resurfacing, a name connected to both Harry and Meghan's early days and to the palace's internal communications team. A liaison, someone who had access to private meetings, records, and, crucially, photographic materials. That person reportedly resigned quietly a few months after Harry and Meghan's wedding. No reason given. No farewell statement. Just vanished from royal employment records. Some say they moved abroad. Others whisper they didn't leave willingly. Whatever the truth, their disappearance left a gaping hole in the palace timeline. Because if this photo came from their files, it might mean that someone inside the royal machinery had been quietly feeding Meghan information long before she was officially part of the firm, which would make her less of an outsider and more of an embedded participant in something much larger. And that realization horrified the palace, because it suggested Meghan wasn't the only one playing a long game. When King Charles reportedly confronted a senior advisor about the signature on the photo, the reply was chillingly vague. Sir, not every meeting is meant to be remembered. Think about that. Not meant to be remembered. A monarchy built on legacy and lineage admitting that certain events were deliberately buried. So what was in that meeting that was so sensitive it needed to vanish? Was it political? Financial? Personal? Or was it something far more intimate? A foreshadowing of alliances, ambitions, and rivalries that would later tear the family apart? Whatever it was, the photograph was proof that the story the world had been sold wasn't the full truth. And the royal family knew that if this ever went public, it would rewrite the narrative of one of the most scrutinized relationships in modern history. But before they could decide what to do with it, another revelation emerged, this time from within the pile of letters still being examined. An internal memo, handwritten in the same style as the king's notes, dated a few weeks after the mysterious photograph. It read, "Follow up with on upcoming engagement project. Confidential brief only. The same initials that appeared years later in countless headlines, charity campaigns, and scandals. The investigators stared at the note in disbelief. Was this the smoking gun? Proof that Meghan Markle had been part of royal correspondence, strategy, or preparation long before the official narrative began. The palace scrambled to contain it. Lawyers were brought in. Archives locked down. But the damage was already done. Because no matter how deep they buried the truth, one fact remained. The signature was real. The photo was real. And the timeline the world believed was, at best, a beautifully crafted illusion. By dawn, reports say, King Charles called an emergency session with his most trusted inner circle. The agenda was simple but devastating. Contain this before it contains us. But one person in that room reportedly disagreed. A woman with a reputation for blunt honesty and zero tolerance for secrets. Princess Anne. And what she said next, her reaction to the discovery, would turn the entire investigation on its head. Because Anne didn't demand silence. She demanded truth. And her next move would shock the royal family to its core. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When the remaining stack of photographs was finally lifted from the velvet-lined box, a wave of tension swept through the room. Every person present knew by now that this wasn't just a collection of mementos, it was evidence. Silent, haunting, undeniable evidence of something the monarchy had never intended the world to see. The photos were wrapped in tissue paper, crisp but old, tied with a silk ribbon that had faded to a smoky gray. When the ribbon fell away, the air seemed to shift. The faint smell of age and ink rose up like the breath of ghosts. The top photo appeared harmless enough at first glance. A garden gathering at Balmoral. Gentle smiles, soft sunlight, the unmistakable presence of royal grace. But the longer you looked, the stranger it became. In the corner, half hidden by a wrought iron trellis, stood Meghan Markle again. Not front and center, not posing, just watching, observing. She wasn't part of the scene, she was studying it. And again, according to official records, she shouldn't have been there. How could one woman appear in photos from royal events she supposedly never attended? Coincidence? A look-alike? Or had the truth always been edited before it reached the public? The next photograph deepened the unease. It showed a table strewn with briefing folders and a tray of tea service. The crest of the crown embossed on every document. And there, almost out of frame, a man's hand signing his name. Unmistakably CR, across the table, blurred but visible, sat a figure with dark hair pulled back, a delicate gold bracelet glinting in the light. The same bracelet Meghan was known to wear years later. The realization hit hard. This wasn't coincidence. This was continuity. A chain of appearances that suggested knowledge, access, maybe even participation in discussions long before the royal narrative began. One of the aides reportedly muttered, "This isn't possible. These images shouldn't exist." Another whispered, "Then explain how they do." And that was the question none of them could answer. Some of the photographs were clearly personal, informal, candid moments. Prince William laughing with and on a balcony. The late Queen standing beside a portrait of her father, smiling faintly. But even these, when found in Meghan's possession, took on new meaning. These weren't public images. They'd never been released. They were taken from angles that only palace insiders would have access to. So how did they end up here? In a California villa, tucked beneath silk and secrecy? The more the investigators examined them, the clearer it became. These photos had been organized, not stolen. Cataloged by event, by year, even by mood. On the back of several prints, faint pencil notes, pre-departure tension, unexpected visitor, private meeting, no press. Whoever collected them had context, insight, purpose, and that purpose terrified the palace. Because while a letter can be explained away, a misunderstanding, a misfiled document, a photograph doesn't lie. It captures the truth in a split second, frozen forever. And these truths were dangerous. One image in particular stopped the king cold. It showed a private dinner held shortly before his coronation planning began. At the table, Charles, Camilla, William, and, shockingly, Harry. The date on the back suggested it was months after Harry had claimed to be estranged from the family, which meant either the public narrative of their feud was false, or the photo had been deliberately hidden to protect an illusion. And who took it? In the reflection of a nearby mirror, the faint outline of a woman holding a camera could be seen. The same silhouette appeared again in another photo, this time during a private charity reception. Small build, dark hair, poised stance. It matched Meghan. Could it be that she had personally taken these photos? Documenting, archiving, building her own record, not of love or nostalgia, but of proof. Because think about it, throughout history, those who feel voiceless often find power in documentation. Letters, diaries, photographs, evidence that they existed, that their version mattered. Maybe that's what Meghan was doing all along, preserving the story before the monarchy could rewrite it. Or maybe, as some palace aides feared, she was building leverage, a private arsenal of truth, waiting for the day it might be needed. The duality is chilling, isn't it? Victim or strategist? Survivor or manipulator? Depends on who you ask. What's certain is that each photo told a story, and together, they formed a pattern. Not chaos. Curation. Intention. Among the stack were also contact sheets, tiny negatives of photos that had never been developed. Some were labeled confidential. Others bore coded initials. On one strip, a note written in Meghan's unmistakable handwriting read, "Keep for my records. Never release." If that doesn't sound like foresight, what does? The king reportedly stared at that particular note for a long time before saying quietly, "She knew what she was doing." Anne's reaction, however, was sharper. "At least she was paying attention," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. That single line silenced the room. Because Anne had a point. Whatever one thought of Meghan, she had anticipated everything. The headlines, the backlash, the betrayals. She had documented her way out of invisibility. And perhaps that was what frightened them most. Because power, in the modern age, isn't inherited, it's recorded. The deeper they went, the darker the collection became. Some photos captured private arguments, heated expressions, tense body language between royals who'd otherwise seemed perfectly united in public. A raised hand here. A tearful glance there. Evidence of the emotional fractures the palace had always denied. Imagine being the one tasked to show those photos to the king. Moments he believed were confined to memory, now lying bare on glossy paper. That's not just scandal. That's humiliation. And yet, one photo stood apart from all the rest. Not because of who was in it, but because of what it showed. It was a black and white shot of a letter spread open on a writing desk. The letter we saw in Chapter 2. The one bearing Charles's signature, the American contact. But this photo revealed more than text. On the corner of the letter, a drop of ink, still wet when the photo had been taken, meaning whoever photographed it had done so immediately after it was written. Someone inside. Someone trusted. Someone who knew exactly what that letter meant. And on the back of the photo, in Meghan's handwriting again, proof of origin. Proof of origin. 3 words that sent tremors through the palace's crisis team. Because now the evidence wasn't circumstantial, it was direct. Whoever gathered this archive had intentionally preserved not only correspondence, but proof of when, where, and how those communications occurred. It was no longer about gossip or rumors. It was about traceability, accountability, exposure. Camilla reportedly called it a minefield ready to detonate. But Anne, she just leaned forward and said, "Then we should stop pretending there's no mine." That blunt honesty shook the king, because beneath the tension and outrage was an unspoken truth, and wanted to face the reality head-on. To find out why these photos existed, who took them, and what Meghan intended to do with them. Her theory was radical. She didn't believe Meghan was blackmailing the family. She believed Meghan had been preparing to protect herself or someone else. Maybe she wasn't keeping secrets, and said. Maybe she was keeping receipts. A chilling possibility, because in that single sentence, and reframed the entire mystery. What if Meghan wasn't the architect of a royal scandal, but the chronicler of one? What if these letters and photographs were her insurance not against attack, but against erasure? That idea spread quietly among some of the younger aides, who whispered that perhaps Meghan knew too much and had learned too early that the palace could twist a story overnight. Better to keep proof, they said, than be rewritten out of history. But for others, the evidence was too deliberate, too perfect. It didn't feel defensive, it felt orchestrated. A controlled leak waiting to happen. Either way, one truth was undeniable. The archive had power. Power enough to make a king silent, a prince furious, and a princess question everything she thought she knew about her sister-in-law. As the last photo was laid out on the table, a strange hush fell over the room. The image showed nothing scandalous, just the late queen, standing at her window, gazing out toward the palace gardens. Peaceful, solitary, the sunlight washing her figure in gold. But beneath that serenity, written faintly on the back in neat script, were 6 words that chilled everyone who read them. She knew. We all always knew. No signature, no date, no clue who wrote it. But whoever did, they had left behind a message that suggested the queen herself had been aware of whatever had been unfolding, long before it reached the tabloids, long before the interviews, long before Megxit. That final photo wasn't explosive because of what it showed. It was devastating because of what it implied. And it left everyone in the room, including King Charles, staring at one another in stunned silence. If the queen had truly known, what else had she kept to herself? What truths did she take with her to the grave? The king reportedly closed his eyes and whispered, "God help us if more of these exist." Because if one sealed box in Montecito held this much history, who's to say there weren't others? Stored elsewhere, hidden by someone else, waiting for the right moment to surface. And that possibility, that there were more, was what terrified the monarchy most. Because 1 box could be dismissed as anomaly. 2 would be coincidence. But 3? That would mean something deliberate, systematic, planned. And rumor had it, there was a second box. A larger one, hidden somewhere else entirely. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The second box wasn't supposed to exist. At least, that's what the palace wanted to believe. But deep down, they all knew, secrets rarely travel alone. The rumor surfaced barely a day after the first discovery. An anonymous message delivered through encrypted email to one of the king's security liaisons contained a single line. If you thought Montecito was the only vault, think again. No name, no location, no demands. Just those 12 words and an attached image. Blurry, grainy, but clear enough to show what looked like another ornate trunk, nearly identical to the first. The same carved emblem. The same wax seal. The same faded silk ribbon. Only this one sat beneath the dim glow of a different villa. Not Meghan's. Not even in California. It was rumored to be in Europe. Somewhere coastal. Somewhere royal. And what set this box apart was the faint shadow visible behind it. The blurred outline of a person. Short hair, formal posture, standing almost protectively near the box, as if guarding it. When analysts brightened the photo, they swore they could make out the faintest silhouette of a uniform. Someone inside the royal machinery. Someone close. The mystery figure, as palace staff began to whisper. At first, suspicion pointed outward. A rogue archivist, a curious aide, even a former security officer who'd gone rogue after Harry and Meghan's departure. But as more details surfaced, the pattern grew chillingly specific. This wasn't some low-level staffer sneaking files into a suitcase. Whoever this person was, they had access to sensitive material, classified storage, and, most alarmingly, the Queen's private correspondence wing. And that meant only a handful of people could fit the profile. When the list was quietly drawn up, it included just 4 names. 2 advisors, 1 royal secretary, and a senior family member. Yes, a family member. The king reportedly went pale when he saw the list. He read it twice, set it down, and said only, "Check the handwriting." Because whoever the mystery figure was, they weren't helping Meghan out of curiosity. They were helping her out of conviction. Now, why would someone within the monarchy take such a risk? Perhaps guilt. Perhaps resentment. Or perhaps something deeper. Something personal. Let's rewind a few years. Long before Meghan married into the family, long before Megxit, there had been murmurs about discontent within the royal inner circle. The new generation wanted transparency, reform, modernization. But the old guard? They preferred shadows. And it was during that quiet ideological battle that one person, always loyal, always pragmatic, had started to question the institution itself. Princess Anne. At first, the idea seemed absurd, and was the definition of discipline. The no-nonsense royal. The rock. The one who followed every rule to the letter. But those who truly knew her also knew this. Beneath her composure burned a fierce independence, an intolerance for hypocrisy, and a loyalty that ran deeper than protocol. And some say that loyalty wasn't just to the crown, it was to truth. Insiders claimed, and had grown uneasy in the years leading up to her mother's passing. She'd watched how the family handled crises, the press manipulation, the internal briefings, the quiet cover-ups. She didn't like it. She didn't like what it was turning them into. And Meghan? Meghan was, in a way, a test case for everything and feared. A woman thrown into a machine that chewed people up for headlines, then rewrote the story to fit the brand. And had been there before, different decade, different scandals, same ghosts. So what if Anne, quietly, privately, had decided to preserve the truth herself? Not for Meghan, not for rebellion, but for history. A shocking theory, right? But here's where it gets eerie. Among the photos retrieved from the first box was one subtle but telling clue. In the corner of a single image, the edge of a distinct brooch could be seen. A small enamel horse, set in gold. Only one royal figure was known to wear it frequently. Princess Anne. Coincidence? Maybe. But when investigators reviewed the metadata of one of the photos, they found something stranger still. The camera model listed was the same brand used by the Princess Royal's private photographer, a man named James H., who had worked exclusively with her for over a decade. When questioned, he reportedly denied any knowledge of the Montecito collection, saying only, "I photograph what I'm told to photograph." That's not denial. That's diplomacy. So imagine this. Anne, quietly frustrated with palace spin, deciding to ensure a record existed. A silent historian in her own family, preserving letters, moments, and secrets before they were lost, or worse, rewritten. And Meghan? Perhaps she was the eventual custodian. The one person outside the monarchy and believed could safeguard the truth if the old system ever imploded. Because one thing Anne had always admired about Meghan, though she rarely said it publicly, was her audacity. She doesn't hide from consequence, and had once reportedly said during a private dinner. She just walked straight into it. That single sentence, leaked years later, sounded more like admiration than criticism. But if Anne had truly played a part in transferring sensitive materials to Meghan's possession, it would explain everything. The authenticity of the letters, the royal stationery, the unbroken seals. No leak could be that precise without inside help. Still, there was one hole in that theory. If and had been the mystery figure, why the second box? Why store another archive elsewhere instead of destroying it? Unless that second box wasn't meant for Meghan. It was meant for the monarchy itself. A mirror archive. A backup copy of everything handed over. One meant to surface only if the other was ever compromised. The kind of safeguard only someone like and meticulous, disciplined, and ruthlessly practical would think to create.